ahead and start recording now. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining this very, very important conversation today. Thank you to our attendees and our panelists, of course. Thank you to Tierney Cherie, who is also co-hosting or co-sponsoring with Recharge Colonialism Coalition. And honestly, this is a very, very important conversation. There's been a number of conversations going on around sanctions, about sanctions, but not specifically diving into the deleterious impact of what sanctions are and what they are intending to do, but also the movements that are on the ground, the grassroots, things that are happening on the ground to mitigate some of those things. But again, the sanctions, the blockades, all of those particular things that, we want to make sure that we address in today's conversation. And we have an esteemed group of panelists and folk that are here to do that. Before I introduce the panelists, I want to allow Tierney Cherie to just say a few words about an upcoming event or conference that are being put on. So I'll just kick it over to Tierney real quick.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tierney. I represent the organization We Charge Colonialism. We're an anti-colonial organization that organizes primarily out of the United States. I'm happy to join this conversation because a lot of the work we've been doing, particularly with the convention that I'll mention, is directly targeting issues such as sanctions. But essentially, this July 21st through 23rd, a coalition of African-led organizations we've created a convention, particularly around the issue of neocolonialism, the abolition of neocolonialism. So the convention's name is Pan-African Unity or Perish, a call for the abolition of neocolonialism. And right along with the issue of sanctions, it will be hosted as a hybrid conference. It'll be hosted inside of Zimbabwe, but also being held online. So if anyone's interested in learning more about that convention and the work that we're doing, AUMD, which is Africa Unity Movement for Decolonization, you could visit our website, wechargecolonialism.org. And there's a tab on top that says AUMD, where it has more information about the convention and also other things that we've done together as a coalition of African-led organizations. So that's all I have on that.
No, thank you. And again, Recharge Colonialism, and of course, when we hear Recharge, as someone who understands Recharge did this out, but the twist and on that particular sharpening exactly what that is about. So as we begin the conversation, one of the things that I wanted to do is to make sure that we have time for all our panelists to give their perspectives. And so as I do that, I just wanted to give a brief introduction, and I will put introductions more extensive as we are moving into, as in the YouTube and all of those other particular things. But I wanted to make sure that we highlight that we have Ambassador Rivera here from the Cuban embassy. We have Ambassador Solomon here. We have Ambassador Duet. We also have grassroots activists. Rotendo is here as well. So I think that it's very, very important to really highlight the range and scope of folk who are actually here to really give a well-rounded, real deeply understanding or exploration into the topic today. And of course, just to reintroduce, this is an exploration of the structural and violent implications of sanctions, how sanctions threaten peace, stability, and development. Our webinar is intended to explore as comprehensively as possible the structural implications, as well as highlight the various innovative community-based programs that have developed to mitigate the impact of the consequences of sanctions. But this latter point is important to spotlight the collective agency of communities in order to understand that there is an opportunity that we must move at a grassroots level, but also at the international level, the diplomatic level, in order to address these deadly consequences of sanctions. So in order of speaker, given that time, there are some time restrictions, and we really appreciate everybody being able to do that. In order of speaker, we will go with Fabia, then we will go with Rotendo, and then we'll go with Ambassador Barani, then Ambassador Simon. Then we will end this particular two-part conversation, Ambassador Rivera. And the reason why I say it's two-part is that we want to give, the panelists have already been given a framework, and I want them to address as best as possible and as comprehensively as possible that framework. But then we want to make sure that the audience, or that we have follow-up with any questions that the audience may be able to have, or the attendees may have, but also any follow-ups that the panelists, because we want the panelists to talk to each other as well. That's important as well. So with that being said, we will start with Fabia to give us, to address the framework that was sent in the letter, and we'll just go from there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Paul. Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here today. And well, I'm talking to all of you from Caracas, Venezuela. I have been asked to give a little briefing about who I am. My name is Fabia Marquez again. I am a career diplomat. I was appointed to Washington, D.C. until 2019. And now I work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in the National Assembly. I am Foreign Relations Advisor to the first Vice President of the National Assembly. And well, as much of you may know, Venezuela has been hit by sanctions. Most of the people think it started in 2016 with the Obama decree, the executive order of Obama, that said that Venezuela was an unusual threat to the national security of the United States. But actually, sanctions started in 2006. The first sanctions were regarding the spare parts for the military areas of Venezuela, and also some sanctions to individuals from the government. Of course, that start moving Venezuela to look for replacement in these areas, and it backlash because on the media you will see that we were getting closer to so-called enemies or terrorists like Russia or Iran or China. And it, as a matter of fact, was an effect of the sanctions that started in that moment. Right now, as you may know, we had passed because we're still going through it, but we are better today. An amazing financial and economic war we're living under it. And I want to share with you some numbers because I think it's very interesting how the sanctions has impacted the whole country, not only, of course, government, because the narrative of the US government is that sanctions are targeted and they really don't have impact on the people of Venezuela or the people of any country, because Venezuela is not the only country under sanctions, of course. For instance, I could tell you that more than 113 officials of the government, but their families and citizens has been impacted directly by sanctions. We have the PDVSA, you know, we are an oil country. PDVSA is under sanctions, not only to export oil, but to produce. And we are not able to import all the chemicals we need for refining. Not even now. In the media, there is a narrative that sanctions are more flexible now. And in the fact that is not happened. 3 days ago, the government office, the GAO, just published again this order when they authorized Chevron, which is one of the US, it is the only US company that is still in Venezuela, along with Halliburton and others, to continue to operate. The operations are reduced only to maintenance and guarding of their assets here and the personnel they have. They are not allowed to produce, to export, or anything yet. Also, we have our airline, our national airline, Conviasa, was sanctioned, so we cannot fly freely, and we have no direct flights to the United States, neither. And of course, as you know, airlines left Venezuela they started leaving, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, more than that. So that is also another obstacle in the relations or the development of the country, if you want to regard only the tourism area, if that would be one of the examples. Then regarding the rights of the people that have been affected is the right to health. We have been very vocal as a government, explaining that there has been children losing, and I want to give you some numbers about losing the right or the opportunity to have operations abroad. We used to use our oil company, Citgo, who is in the United States, to do social work with the people of Venezuela, the Venezuelan citizens, and sometimes also with the US citizens, like the heating and oil program we had in place during winter in the East Coast, mainly of the United States. But after sanctions hit it and the US government recognized the Wikipedia government of Juan Guaido, as we call it, that is stopped, and we haven't been able to address these issues. If we go to the health, to the water sector, for instance, we have numbers that the amount of water, the access of water of any regular citizen in Venezuela has been reduced from 416 cubic meters we had per person in 2013 to 262 cubic meters in 2018. And the loss of the oil barrels per day, for instance, at the end of 2019, were around circling the $116 million. Venezuela used to produce close to 3 million barrels monthly, 2.5, more or less. Today, we're barely reaching now 500,000 or more. Also, the consequences, I want to give you other numbers I have here. The medical equipment, surgeries, there has been 1,000 less in surgeries in our hospitals per year after sanctions. We have go back in all the social development we had, like we were a free of literacy country, and now it has been a struggle for the government to keep the spending in all the social areas, in the health areas. Even though it has been a priority for the government has not stopped spending money and listening to the needs of the people. They have reinvented the way they bring all the benefits to the people to try to make it more direct. But as you may know, also, importing food has been a nightmare for us. Our accounts have been frozen as a government. Any account that had Venezuelan government on its name was frozen, and the money is there. They just robbed it. After Guaido, they decided some of the banks to give it to them. I'm not going even to go into the issue of the gold and the United Kingdom, because that's a whole another topic for a discussion, but it has impacted all of our spending and our capacity to buy. And that's why we use diplomats or individualities to try to bring food to Venezuela. You may have listened or known about Alex Saab, who is currently being hostage in the US. He was kidnapped, and what was he doing is try to circumvent the sanctions around the globe to bring food and medicine for the people of Venezuela. That is one of the examples we can talk about more later. So the public revenue has been reduced by 99%. The country lives on 1% of its pre-sanctions income. The amount of dollars, the million of dollars of the Venezuelan assets frozen in banks in the States and the UK and Portugal, only those three, it's around $6 million. 6,000 would be $6,000 million. Also, the private sector and their organizations and the universities, most of the sectors are reluctant, of course, to deal with Venezuela, because that is what we call the over-compliance of sanctions. You said, okay, the only sanction is this minister and this company, and that's all. No, but no one wants to risk their business or their government to have an issue with one of the biggest powers in the earth, was the United States or the European Union, who has been also imposing sanctions on Venezuela. So that is closing even more our range of action. Also, The impediments to food imports are around, have made that more than 2.5 million of Venezuela are suffering of food insecure. But and what has been happening in Venezuela until last year is that the population, to cope with the situation, they reduce the meal intake. So this is affecting the nutrition. This is affecting the whole people, the children. And during the pandemic, the sanctions didn't stop. We were imposed, I think, around 15 more sanctions during the pandemic in 2020, even though there was a humanitarian crisis around the world. And the hospitals, even though in Venezuela, the hospital never were overflow like other countries, thanks to the policies of the government, we went into quarantine very early in March 2020. And the government was able to deal with the situation, and also the population was very disciplined. I have to recognize that, even though we are Caribbean people, majority Afro descendants, and we tend to be, people that is always in touch, so close, touchy to each other. We were very disciplined about the measures, and the amount of the death rate in Venezuela is very low. One of the lowest compared to the Western hemisphere. And well, I don't know if I leave it till there, so we can have a discussion later, and I let my colleagues to speak. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much for that very important outline of what's happening right now and currently. We will go to Rotendo.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me. Right, my name is Rotendo. I am from Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement, or what we call ZASM. So we're an organization that was created to fight US, EU, and UK sanctions, and basically sanctions from the Western world that were imposed on Zimbabwe by the Western world. And the sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe after we undertook land reform, took land that had been colonized and taken by the colonizer, gave it back to our people, and then the Western world decided to impose sanctions on Zimbabwe. They imposed a number of sanctions. The first were congressional sanctions that were imposed by the Congress of the United States, and they were called ZIDERA, Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Bill, which is totally the opposite of that, because it has actually destroyed our economy. Now, this very first set of congressional sanctions were imposed on the government of Zimbabwe, together with its parastatals, to deny them access to loans from multilateral lending institutions, and more importantly, to deny them cancellation of colonial debts. Now, you need to understand the importance of blocking the cancellation of colonial debts was because after 90 years of colonialism, Zimbabwe was entitled to a development grant that was given by the Western countries in order to try and stop our government from getting reparations. So instead of paying reparations after we won the war against our oppressors, they decided to say, we will give you grants, and those grants will not be given upfront, but they will actually be given as debts that will be canceled in future after our government has developed the infrastructure, developed the social projects that were required for the native peoples that they were denied during colonialism in contravention of the UN Charter. So by denying Zimbabwe the cancellation of these debts, what it is that the United States, the Europeans, and the United Kingdom were doing is they were basically denying Zimbabwe the ability to get back what was lost during colonialism, and in order for them to cancel debts that were incurred because of the colonial legacy of underdevelopment. And so by denying Zimbabwe loans that were supposed to be reconstruction and development after the War of Independence, that War of Independence was also accompanied by UN sanctions that were imposed on the colonizer. But in reality, those sanctions that were imposed by the UN on the colonizer actually underdeveloped this new Zimbabwe that would be independent, put into black hands. And when it needed to develop itself from that underdevelopment, we are then denied of the loans to build schools, roads, hospitals, and infrastructure for electricity. So what this has done, these congressional sanctions have done, is they've basically reinstituted the colonial underdevelopment, and they've also put the impact of the sanctions that were put by the UN on Rhodesia, or the colonial power. They've actually multiplied the effect of that underdevelopment, deindustrialization, by the impositions of this congressional sanctions. We then have another set of sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe, which are supposedly the targeted sanctions. These are the executive order sanctions of the United States. They were imposed by the president through presidential executive orders. And this was after the United States President George Bush in 2001 declared Zimbabwe a threat to US interests, US economic interests, and US foreign policy interests in the region. So what that basically meant is that even though it is not defined in clear terms, because Zimbabwe had taken its land, given it to Black people, and with that land came the power to control the resources of that land, Zimbabwe, its government, and its politicians were deemed to be threats to US economic interest, US foreign policy interests, and US economic interests. And we believe that that was the case because if you understand the foundation of the United States, it is founded on the doctrine of discovery. In 1453 law that basically gave Europeans, particularly the Portuguese, Spanish, and then out through to all the other Europeans, the right to go to any part of the world where people were not Christian, where natives were brown-skinned, and to take over that land and to enslave the people into perpetuity. Till today, the existence of the United States is premised on this law of discovery. It is premised on taking land from native peoples and non-Christian peoples on the basis that they have no right to control that land, but that land must be controlled by the West, and the West has got the preemption right as to how the resources, the land, or anything from that land can be sold, including the labor of the people. So we look at that law, that discovery law of 1454, as the premise upon which Zimbabwe became a threat to the United States and other Western powers, in that the Zimbabwean people had decided to reverse the discovery doctrine by giving native peoples access and control of their resources or restitution to that which was taken during colonialism. And so we believe that the ability of our people to control their land and their resources threatens Western rights, threatens Western control and hegemony of Africa, Asia, and even the Americas and Australia and Canada, which continue to be colonized territories in which the native peoples are subjugated. And because of Zimbabwe being a threat to the United States, by taking back what belongs to Zimbabweans, they evoked a weapon that is being used, an economic weapon that is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Now, what the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does is, instead of making the sanctions targeted at the initial number of 58 people that were put on the initial list of sanctions that were called Executive Orders 13288, they then also, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, it then also makes sure that it actually targets the entire nation, because that nation that is being deemed as a threat to the United States must be neutralized by a weapon, and in this case, the weapon is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This act blockades payments to a country that is being seen as a threat to the United States. It makes sure that there is no passing of technology, no passing of machinery, no passing of any goods or services manufactured in the United States, and it also prohibits any assistance to this threat. Now, the reason I'm making this very clear is that the United States is very deceptive in this implementation of these sanctions. Their executive orders that initially started in 2001 described and outlined the special designated nationals or people that were supposedly targeted. But the moment that this happens with those executive orders that automatically come with the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act then supersedes this list of people to actually target the people and the government upon which the national emergency has been called. So while you are looking at the targeted individuals who started off as 58, then in 2005, they were increased to 86 through another through another executive orders that was 13391. And then in 2008, they then increased them and put another third executive order that was now to become 1346269. That in itself meant that the numbers of people kept increasing. But at the end of the day, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act supersedes these targets, supersedes these names to actually have a blanket sanction on the entire nation, the entire government, its local governments, all parastatals, and any companies owned by the government of Zimbabwe. So it is this arbitrary nature of the sanctions that are deceptive to seem like they're targeted on individuals, yet they're collective punishment of civilians, why we formed the organization to start fighting them. But more critically, even if the sanctions were targeted on the 141 people that are said to be targeted now, a lot of those people that are being targeted have never been tried in any court. So they are charged for having violated human rights, then they were never charged, they were never taken into any court, they were never tried and given an opportunity to defend themselves. So in essence, they are people who are being punished without trial. So it's basically extrajudicial punishment, which is a contravention of the Bill of Human Rights, or the Universal Bill of Human Rights, of laws that were created by the United States itself when it created the United Nations sorry about that. I had a phone call coming in. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So what we're saying is, even if the targeted sanctions were supposedly targeted, as long as the individuals who are being punished by sanctions, by having their properties taken, being deprived from undertaking international trade, from traveling internationally, and having their bank accounts blocked, those people themselves, as long as they've never been tried in any court, as long as they've never been tried by any existing law, and as long as they've never been tried by a court competent to actually charge them, they cannot be punished by sanctions. And any punishment by sanctions is extrajudicial punishment. It's like slavery, where the master simply said the slave is wrong, whipped him, without any real convention or without any real code to determine the punishment. So that already says that the targeted sanctions themselves are illegal. And then when we go to the sanctions that are blanket on the government, which delivers services to civilians, that is a deprivation of civilians from the enjoyment of their human rights. And that collective punishment of civilians is illegal at international law. It's a contravention of human rights. It's persecution of civilians. And to a certain extent, we might actually say it's a crime against humanity upon civilians who are denied water, healthcare, education, jobs, economic development, and all the rights that are enshrined within the Human Rights Declaration and other human rights laws and treaties that the United States is signatory to. So because of understanding this, as an organization, we decided that Zimbabwe had been under sanctions for 18 years when we were formed. And in those 18 years, there had been no real challenge to the sanctions other than rhetoric. And where it was challenged legally by people like Obi, there was a removal of sanctions on the health budget of the Global Health Fund that had stopped giving Zimbabwe money. So it took people like Obi in 2006 to actually challenge the United States, to actually challenge the Global Fund and other health institutions to release funds to Zimbabwe, and they did it successfully. We then wanted to take it from where Obi and other civil society organizations had left it in releasing our health funds from the Global Fund to taking this issue now into a legal issue. We decided to depoliticize it, and we said, let's make this a legal fight. Let's make this fight an equal playing field by taking it to the international law and taking it to the human rights law arena so that we can begin to challenge the existence of these sanctions utilizing existing laws. So we went and referred to a resolution that exists in the UN Human Rights Council that is called Resolution 3413. The Resolution 3413 was created in 2017, was a means by the UN Human Rights Commission to actually create a framework to illegalize the use of unilateral sanctions and to actually begin to seek reparations, restitution, and damages from sanction senders by nations that are suffering under sanctions. The same resolution also stipulates that countries that are under sanctions must mitigate those sanctions, must not cooperate with sanctions. And those countries that are not under sanctions, or third-party countries, are actually enjoined to avoid implementing illegal sanctions. So what we started to do is we started to look at who is imposing sanctions on Zimbabwe and who's implementing the sanctions. How is the United States, the Europeans, and the UK implementing these sanctions? And we realized that they implement them through financial institutions that are American, financial institutions that are non-American, that over-comply by implementing these sanctions. So the very first action that we took is in South African courts, where we have gone to sue all South African banks and US banks that are operating from South Africa, which is the biggest trading partner of Zimbabwe. We're taking them through the courts to actually challenge the implementation of these illegal sanctions. And now we've got a basis upon which to call these sanctions illegal, in that the special rapporteur of the UN Human Rights Council, who measures the negative impact of sanctions, actually came to Zimbabwe to measure the impact of these sanctions. After she measured the impact of these sanctions, she issued a preliminary report that declared the sanctions illegal, and that declared the implementation and enforcement or compliance to these sanctions illegal too. So that gave us a basis for us to start the legal challenge on these sanctions in South African courts. We would take it to the African court, and eventually we would like to make sure that we've got enough precedents to take it to the International Court of Justice. But one thing we've decided to do is to say that many Africans complain that international laws do not favor Africans, but they favor Europeans. We have decided to say you cannot expect law to affect you or to benefit you if you do not create the precedents that favors you. So part of the reason why we as Africans, why we as Zimbabweans, on behalf of Africa, are now challenging these sanctions in African courts is to begin to create the case law, is to begin to create the theory and practice or custom for Africans fighting for their rights, particularly against illegal sanctions within African courts, to give African courts the say, the power to make the law, and to actually start setting the custom and precedents that can be used in future. We then will go to the African court. Again, we intend to pull the United States and their institutions through African institutions to give our African institutions gravitas, to give our African institutions a say in how international law is being created. So by the time we leave Africa to go to the International Court of Justice, we are actually going to have precedents and custom that has been set by African courts, through which we're going to now enforce in the International Court of Justice to create case law or to create custom that favors Africans. The Iranians taught us to do this. They took the United States to the International Court of Justice after they were already under UN sanctions for infringing the atomic or nuclear proliferation. But even though they were under UN sanctions, the Iranians went to the International Court of Justice, challenged American sanctions that were imposed together with UN sanctions unilaterally, and they won. There's currently dispute as to challenges to that or review to that particular International Court of Justice ruling of 2018, but the Iranians have already set a precedence that it can be done. So I just want to close this by saying that the impact of the sanctions on Zimbabwe has been that the collective sanctions on the Zimbabwean people, which are both from the congressional sanctions together with the executive order sanctions, has been the denial of Zimbabwean government of funds, and the denial of the Zimbabwean government of loans, the denial of Zimbabwean government of assistance and aid in order to give the Zimbabwean people all that they need socially and economically to develop the country. And this is particularly heinous when you understand that the Zimbabwean government took over a country that had been under colonialism for 90 years. Africans were basically deprived of all basic rights in contravention of the League of Nations Chapter 11 and in contravention of the UN Charter. But still, the British did not give the Zimbabwean people basic human rights. And when our government came in to undertake the role of giving Black people and giving all Zimbabweans the basic human rights denied by colonialism, we then had the sanctions that were imposed on us. And to some extent, some might say Zimbabwe has been under sanctions since the colonialism began. But more importantly, even when the colonialism ended, we had the UN sanctions that were on the Rhodesian government for 14 years being imputed on the Zimbabwean people because we now had to develop our industry from the underdevelopment. We now had to develop the infrastructure that wasn't developed while under UN sanctions during colonialism. And when we got independence, we did not get reparations. We did not get the tools to develop our country or to lift it from the underdevelopment of the 14 years of UN sanctions that were imposed on a colonizer, but inherited by our country. Instead, we were forced to take over the colonial debt of the colonial government, which is part and parcel of why the Zimbabwean government owes a lot of money to multilateral institutions, because it is colonial debt and a lack of payment of reparations. So now, as we fight these sanctions, part and parcel of our objective is to convince other Africans to join us in this action, because we need to make sure that we make a statement that sanctions cannot continue to be used on African countries. And if indeed the West continue to use these sanctions on African countries, there should be repercussions in that we shall demand reparations for these crimes against humanity, for this persecution, and for this underdevelopment that is caused by sanctions. We shall also ask for damages. And we shall also approach, like now, we are part and parcel of our agenda is to approach American companies, European companies, and British companies that have been denied access into Zimbabwe by these illegal US, EU, and UK sanctions that have denied them access into a country by illegal sanctions. So all the mining companies in America have lost out to the Chinese, lost out to the Russians because of their own government prohibiting them through the International Emergency Economic Powers Act from investing in Zimbabwe by implementation of illegal sanctions. Those losses, those financial losses by American companies, those financial losses by European companies, those financial losses by British companies should actually be penalties upon the American government, European governments, and UK governments for denying people access into Zimbabwe, which is very contrary to free market economics. And that's why we want to convince
Rotendo, let me just interject really quick here, because we want to make sure that we allow time for the rest of our panelists to go. Thank you very much, and we'll be able, and you'll be able to get more out in the conversation. I wanted to make just a slight little change here, and I wanted to add Simon come on, and I didn't do something that I should have done at the beginning of this, is give everybody a time limit. So I hate to do it now, but I really want us to get into a robust discussion. And so if we can go give 10 to 15 minutes. Moving forward, you don't have to take the whole 10 or the whole 15, because we really want to get into a discussion. So we'll go with Simon, and then we'll go with our friends and colleagues and comrades with the Eritrean embassy, and then we will go with our friends and colleagues and comrades at the Cuban embassy now. So Simon will go, and then we'll move to Ambassador Solomon, and then we'll move there. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me okay? Excellent. I actually, I know that our ambassador, esteemed ambassador, Barhane Solomon, he's very, very busy. If it's okay, and also the other embassy staff at this very, very crazy time, maybe they can go before me, if that's okay.
No, that is absolutely wonderful and gracious of you. So we will Ambassador Solomon, if you wanted to step right in, or if Ambassador Rivera, if you wanted to step in, Ambassador Rivera, you wanted to go? Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity of participating in this webinar to share some views on the economic and financial and commercial blockade against Cuba, which is the central axis of the US government's policy towards Cuba. Our country have lived for 60 years under the siege of this complex mechanism of sanctions, intensified at times of greatest vulnerability for the Cuban people. If we go to the history of the sanctions, although the blockade against Cuba was officially decreed in 1962, its application dates back to the very moment of the revolution in 1959, and has been a permanent tool in the policy of the different US administration towards Cuba. But on February 1962, then President John F. Kennedy declared the unilateral blockade against Cuba through the Foreign Aid Act of 1961. The objective at that time and today was and is clear: to suffocate the nation economically and starve the Cuban people, lacking the resources prohibited by Washington's policy towards the Cuban government. In 1992, the Torricelli Act made the blockade an extraterritorial matter by sanctioning third nations, because that law prohibits US subsidiaries in third countries from trading goods with Cuba. Subsequently, the Helms-Burton Act in 1996 intensified and further reinforced that hostile policy against the Cuban people, and codified the blockade by removing executive power to the White House for controlling and enacting the foreign policy on Cuba. If we come to the recent times, we could say that during the Donald Trump's administration, 243 unilateral coercive measures were applied against Cuba, which stood out for their systematicity and intentionality. In the course of the Biden administration, this system of unilateral coercive measures had remained almost intact, with severe effects on national efforts to contain the pandemic and alleviate the economic and social consequences that came from it. A few days ago, as you probably heard, the White House announced some measures making small changes to the sanctions against our country. This decision have limited impact in the enforcement of the blockade, but they are a move in the right direction. We could say that at current prices, the accumulated damage in 6 days of application of this policy amount to $147,853.3 million US dollars. Taking into account the depreciation of the dollar against the value of gold in the international market, the blockade has caused damages of more than $1,377,998,000. The blockade, in our case, includes a set of measures of aggression and economic coercion, with the declared intention of isolating, suffocating, and immobilizing Cuba and created unrest in the Cuban population. It imposes restriction on imports and exports to and from Cuba, as well as on traveling, remittances, commerce with third countries, telecommunication, finance, banking, among others. The impact of all these sectors is enormous, as well as on others which are essential in society, such as healthcare, education, transportation, tourism, and agriculture. Non-sectors of the Cuban economy, neither aspects of our life escape from the damage of the blockade. The blockade, for example, prevents Cuba from accessing to faster and more expeditious transportation logistic routes, which forces, in our case, the transfer of supply through several countries at a high additional cost. There is a growing refusal of financial and banking institutions in various countries to process operation with Cuba, which has prevented timely financial transactions with suppliers of purchases inputs. During the pandemic, for instance, Cuba had to resort to other suppliers as intermediaries for obtaining medical components, which meant a price increase that ranged from between 50 and 65% of the historical established price, given the impossibility of contracting directly with the manufacturer. The sanctions, in our case, have consequences that cannot be quantified, such as unsatisfied needs, limited family ties, obstacle to academic, scientific, and cultural exchanges. These measures reduce the quality of life and the possibility of full enjoyment of rights. This reaches all Cuban citizens without discrimination of sex, age, or race. It affects the daily life of everyone, women included. We all face a great obstacle for national production of food and the acquisition of it. Companies in charge of manufacturing food products, for example, in the country, have to import almost 70% of their raw material from different markets, but not from the US. However, today the blockade has made it impossible to make those purchases in the US market, which is very attractive because we are neighbors. If we go to the implication on other institutions, for example, the development of culture in all its forms is a priority for the Cuban state. However, these sectors continue to be one of the most affected by the application of the US blockade against Cuba. Social development, education, technology, and art are all strongly impacted by the sanctions, taking into account that we confront difficulties in inserting ourselves into international trade with current and potential partners, carry out financial operation, and acquire basic supply for these sectors. The effects of the blockade on the health sector only in 2020 amount to $198 million, more than that dollars, which reflects the magnitude of the impact of this policy. For example, in the context of the pandemic, the blockade has been a significant obstacle to face the economic and health consequences of the disease. More than 30 products and supplies that are urgently required for the protocols, prevention, and treatment of COVID-19 were unable to be purchased because of the blockade. We have several examples that we can share with you if you are interested. In conclusions, when you add up all this that I have mentioned before, you can conclude that the blockade is the main obstacle to advancing in the search for the prosperity and well-being of the Cuban population. And this is my bottom line. To ignore its existence would not be only to be untrue, but also to insult a people that has no other paradigm of development that marked by the most genocidal blockade applies against any country. The international community, as you might know, each year votes against the blockade, and Cuba really appreciate that critical support. Thank you so much for having me today in this webinar. It is my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And just to move along, Ambassador Solomon, by all means.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Well, first of all, thank you for the organizers, co-sponsors, and also Obi for keeping us connected. I would like to also thank my colleagues who shared their experience on the sanctions. Well, for us, Eritrean sanctions has been there for us since the inception of our nation. There's nothing good can come from sanctions, as our experience tells us. Sanctions are always entitled by the rich and powerful countries to punish developing or poor countries, they use a very deceptive mechanism of lies to make their sanctions appealing to others. And it's also illegal. I mean, countries who wanted to police other countries are using sanctions without any legal premises. And also sanctions always are provocative and make people react and also make countries and regions volatile. And I can say sanctions are always anti-peace, source of poverty and a means of betrayal. And after all, nothing will come from sanctions. Sanctions are always useless for the people of the world, but sanctions are the best tools for those who want to punish others. So for us, it's always that we have to fight sanctions and stop that the notion that all powerful nations can punish others by sanctions. As we speak today, Eritrea is under unilateral sanctions by the United States. The Eritrean Defense Forces, all the parastatal economic development companies of Eritrea who operate under trustship fund to develop the economy, and important officials of the country are under sanctions. We believe unilateral sanctions are illegal because no one should sanction the other based on their own interests without considering engagement and partnership. So for Eritrea, the first time that sanctions were applied is during decolonization. Eritrea was under the Italian colony for about 51 years. The Italians were defeated during the Second World War in 1941 in Eritrea by the British. And the British then promised Eritrea, once the Italians are defeated, Eritrea would be an independent nation by using a transition period of 10 years to administer Eritrea. Then the British dishonored their promise. And at that time, the involvement of the United States at the end of the World War was very significant. And American team, a team of American military communication experts visited Eritrea at that time when the British were administering Eritrea. And they tested the geographical location of Eritrea, if they can use it for communications interception. So people might wonder why the United States was against Eritrean independence and why the United States and the European countries were against Eritrean liberation, because of the geopolitical interests, but also particularly from the experience of the Italian naval station that was stationed in Asmara. They thought during that time, in the absence of satellites, the positioning of their communications in Asmara, in the capital city of Asmara, Eritrea, was very significant. And the team tested that in 1943, April 1943, and they were successful in their tests, and they believed that they had to have a long-term interest in Eritrea. And I don't know why they were not considering Eritrea an independent state, cooperating with them. They because of their hegemonic thinking, they said they have to gain support of the king in Ethiopia and then annex Eritrea with Ethiopia so that they can use it for their own benefits. That's why they established the Kanyo station, a very well-known eavesdropping spy station for the Americans then. There's a good example of that successful communication interception that they were doing, in October 1943, the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, they invited the Japanese ambassador in Germany to visit their front lines. And then the visit was reported back to Tokyo. All the details that were reported to Tokyo were intercepted from the station in Asmara and was presented to Eisenhower to make the Normandy deployment decisions that ended the Second World War. So from that time, the United States sees Eritrea an important geographical, geopolitical place, but always sees it from the interest of its Ethiopian diplomatic connections and security interests. So Eritrea was supposed to be decolonized and independent in 1941, but then the British promised that they were going to administer Eritrea for 10 years, and Eritrea was supposed to be liberated or free by 1951. In 1951, the United States, the British, and the Ethiopian king conspired, agreed that Eritrea remains under Ethiopian occupation or annexed to Ethiopia. There is a famous saying statement by John Foster Dulles that he said in 1951. From the point of justice, the opinion of the Eritrean people for independence must receive consideration. Nevertheless, the strategic interests of the United States in the Red Sea basin and considerations of security and the world peace make it necessary that the country of Eritrea has to be linked with our ally Ethiopia. This is the beginning of the United States sanctioning Eritrean independence from the beginning. We have sanctions today, but the same sanctions were there in 1951, whether the sanctions are formal or informal. So Eritreans had to pay a heavy price to get the independence. We paid a very heavy price. We have paid about 65,000 young people to liberate Eritrea. And Eritrea was liberated in 1991 in defense of all the odds. No Western country was willing to accept Eritrea as a free nation, but Eritreans did it. So we had a brief period of peace with Ethiopia from 1991 to 1998. Then it was the only time that the United States and Western countries were not hostile. They were not supportive, but they were not also hostile against Eritrea. We didn't feel any kind of sanctions during those 7 years. In 1998, the TPLF-led government in Ethiopia invaded Eritrea. Within no time, the United States and the Europeans sided with Ethiopia. And they started supporting them by all means to defeat Eritrea. Their dream was to bring back Eritrea into Ethiopia, to annex again Eritrea. That we had to fight it hard. Again, we had to pay about 20,000 young people to defend our independence. The war ended in 2000. We had to go to the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission in The Hague. The commission had to make decisions on the boundaries that were taken as a pretext for the war. Then in 2002, in April, the verdict came and Eritrea accepted the verdict. Ethiopia rejected it. The irony, the Western powers promised that during the signing of the agreement, anyone who rejects the agreement had to be punished depending on the United Nations Charter 7. When Ethiopia rejected, not only they didn't punish Ethiopia, they supported Ethiopia against Eritrea. And they sanctioned Eritrea using pretext of involvement of Eritrea in Somalia, which never existed, which the Eritrea-Somalia Monitoring Group said didn't find any evidence. But because the jury, the judge, and the accuser are the same, then they had to pass a resolution condemning Eritrea, sanctioning Eritrea. Eritrea had to stay under sanction from 2019 until 2018. A change came in Ethiopia, a new government in Ethiopia, and it had accepted the EEBC decision, and Eritrea and Ethiopia signed the peace and friendship agreement. We made peace. The agreement was signed on Sunday, and United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres visited Ethiopia on Monday and met the new Prime Minister. That day, Secretary General Guterres declared that the sanctions against Eritrea must be lifted because the two countries have made peace. So they told us we were sanctioned just because we had a problem with Ethiopia, because we were in conflict with Ethiopia. So we knew it was unjust, but the Secretary General revealed that the sanctions were meaningful support to Ethiopia, but once the two countries are in good terms, sanctions are not needed. And then in November 2018, the sanctions were lifted. So we live under sanctions from the beginning. Now it has now gone about 81 years, starting from 1941 up to now. So we live in defiance, we fight it, we don't cooperate with sanctions, and we don't accept it. And we are enduring, we are prevailing. Every time they put sanctions against us, we have to fight. But with consequence, as the theme of this forum detailed it, there are consequences, economic consequences. We have been denied to develop our economy. We had to pay a heavy price. There is a heavy human toll that we lose because of these sanctions, and the sanctions provoked conflicts that they are instilling in our region, in our neighborhood. So the British in 1950, to prove that Eritrea is incapable of being a nation, they destroyed all the infrastructure. So the sanctions followed by destruction of Eritrea's 50 years built infrastructure to make it incapable of being a nation. Recently, in the 2009 sanctions, European countries like Germany were involved in financing gold mining in Eritrea as we develop our mines. Because of the sanctions, they had to pull out. JP Morgan withdrew from the Kolili potash project, which has a prospect of 200 years and one of the best potash sites in the world. We were unable to buy even development materials, spare parts, fishing boats, airplanes. Everything was under sanctions, and we had to live, fight, and endure all these sanctions, but with consequence of putting our economy still backwards. The other thing that the sanctions made damaged is that the TPLF-led movement and its ideology in the Horn of Africa was emboldened by the sanctions that they put against us. You all remember November 2020, the TPLF launched a new war against its own army, against its own government, in contrary to the constitution that the TPLF itself wrote and ratified. The West decided to side with the TPLF and didn't engage the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments on how to solve the current conflict. So last year in September, President Biden made an executive order trying to put Eritrea and Ethiopia under sanctions. The war is happening in Ethiopia. Eritrea was involved only when it was attacked by the TPLF, by the missile launch made by the TPLF. But the executive order was also implemented, not in Ethiopia, but also against Eritrea. They decided last November that the Eritrean Defense Forces, all the parastatal companies, development companies in Eritrea, and all important individual officials who have nothing to do with the war that had happened in Ethiopia, and they defamed the Eritrean army for committing atrocities and trying to sanction Eritrea. So everything they are doing is to destroy Eritrea. And this is not happening only for Eritrea, but many countries, as we have been hearing from our colleagues, and other countries throughout the world. So what is the prospect of sanctions in the future? What can we do? For Eritreans, this is part of our life, to fight against sanctions and endure and live in liberty from all the hegemonic attempts made against us. The only thing to fight sanctions is that we have to say no more, which Simon, I think, is going to speak about that. We have to say no more for the hegemony, no more for the sanctions, and try to work in unison. All like-minded people, like-minded countries, like-minded organizations and individuals have to come together and defeat the idea of sanctions that the powerful countries are using to punish developing countries and people like Eritrea. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and nice segue to Simon.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event today. And I want to thank you for all the esteemed colleagues, esteemed officials, dignitaries who gave their statements of fighting the good fight, defending, these countries that are under attack, fighting imperialism. And so to be on today with them it's really an honor. If you don't mind, I have just Ambassador Berhane Solomon. He just actually gave a lot of stuff that I was going to say. I was going to do a little bit on Eritrea and then move into like this no more movement that has evolved as this Pan-African movement to defend against sanctions, a global movement really. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to maybe share my screen, or should I just talk? I have a presentation.
We can try. Let's see. Let's try.
It's no big deal.
Okay. Yeah. Just go ahead and talk. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So I'll spare everyone the details of the historic Eritrean struggle. What I will say is that actually, as Ambassador Berhane just mentioned, since day one, sanctions were a part of life in Eritrea. And, I want to reiterate that in 1997, Eritrea had 8% growth. It was one of the fastest growing countries in the world at that time. And this is 1997. And unsurprisingly, Eritrea was plunged into war by TPLF, which led the Ethiopian people astray, and basically, served as the attack dog in the region. And basically, it came down to Eritrea and Ethiopia, as who is going to lead the destinies of the people of the Horn of Africa, one representing the peoples of the Horn, the other one representing external forces. And so it was clear that Eritrea was a model that had to be put down. We can talk about Eritrea's mining sector, that was just mentioned now. It was clear that the Eritrean mining sector was a target of the sanctions. And in fact, when the first round of sanctions were passed in 2009, UN sanctions, that is, there was a follow-up sanctions in 2011 when they realized just how advanced the Eritrean mining sector had become and how it had presented a new model for Africa in terms of the share of the profits that African country will be getting in terms of mining. When they realized this, they said, okay, we've got to put down this model. Actually, I had cited for you here a wiki leak from the US ambassador at the time. This was back in 2006. And in this wiki leak, you have the ambassador saying, basically, the quote, third, when he's actually listing out the problems with the Eritrean mining sector, he says, third, the potential under the existing law for the government of the state of Eritrea to have nearly 30% ownership in a mining extraction company is inconsistent with the 10% ownership that has become the standard of other parts of Africa. So clearly he's pointing out the fact that Eritrea was creating a model of shared profits with these companies that come into the country, where actually it's not just 30%, it's actually 40%. And when you add in royalties, you're talking about 60, 70%, of profits coming to Eritrea, the people of Eritrea. And you saw this replicated in other countries. Tanzania is another one that we can talk about. And people began to take notice. So Eritrea became a target of sanctions, and specifically the mining companies, because this was essentially a way of, if you don't have oil or you don't have, there's something that's going to bring those dollars to the country, and they just specifically targeted that. Now it's evolved to potash mining and other sorts of things, but still in the mining sector. So what I'm trying to say is, I could go on actually about Eritrea, but I think we've come to a point where I think, talking about more of what the response is by the people of Eritrea, the people of the Horn of Africa, people of Africa, in regards to sanctions at the current moment. So as I said, the sanctions were implemented against Eritrea, 2009, new round of them in 2011, targeting the mining sector. So these were repealed in 2018. And I want everybody to think about this for 1 second. UN sanctions. Give me an instance where UN sanctions, multilateral sanctions, have been removed against the country with zero concessions. Nothing was given up. But what did Eritrea give up in order to get the sanctions repealed? So the question is, how did that happen? If we go back to 2010, immediately after the sanctions happened at the end of 2009, this was about February 22nd, 2010, Eritreans around the world got together and had these global demonstrations against the UN. And all this stuff was documented on the eSmart website, which is, I had a screenshot of it, but basically it was this anti-sanctions movement within the Eritrean community, global community, to fight these sanctions. And it's part of this older tradition that goes back to the 30-year Eritrean struggle, in which the people come together and they engage in what was known as Hizbawi Mahate, which means popular resistance. There's not an exact translation, but popular rebuff, popular resistance of the people. So everywhere around the world, if you're an Eritrean, you go to your local community, there's this kind of like a resistance committee kind of thing. It just naturally, it's part of the infrastructure of struggle that was created over 30 years. And everywhere you go around the world, there's these groups. And what they did is they, whenever the home country is under attack, we mobilize. And so, there were these global demonstrations that happened, which then led to consistently challenging them at every single corner, while the back home government people, military, are doing what they need to do in order to change the geopolitics of the region, defend the country. And so what happened was political changes happened in Ethiopia, which, by the way, was predicted by President Isaias in the 90s. Actually, it was recorded by Robert Kaplan when he was talking in Surrender or Starve, in which he talks about the basically says that Oromos will continue to ask for power because TPLF is essentially greedy with its power, and you're making all the resources go to themselves, enriching themselves, and eventually they're going to flip out. The government's going to fall. So that happened, and that happened in 2018. And the historic pictures of an Oromo prime minister who had come to power, shaking hands with President Isaias. That was, by the way, Prime Minister Abiy in Ethiopia and President Isaias in Eritrea. When that happened, that was in the summer of 2018. A few months later, that fall, Eritrea was able to remove the sanctions. Abiy received the Nobel Peace Prize, which is odd that President Isaias didn't also get the peace prize, because usually when you have a peace between two countries, it's the two leaders that get the peace. But Eritrea is the target, and they couldn't have that type of positive PR. So of course, they gave it to Prime Minister Abiy. But you know what? At the end of the day, I don't think anyone should be proud about getting a Nobel Peace Prize, given the history of that institution. But anyway, what we do know, though, is that the sanctions were repealed. Eritreans had a history of struggle and resistance and infrastructure that had already existed for all these years, fighting and fighting and fighting, going back to the struggle. And it was from the people. So that being said, when TPLF, which Ambassador Berhane just mentioned earlier, this ethnic type of, the term that's used nowadays by Elias Amare, one of our esteemed comrades, is ethno-fascist. Throughout Ethiopia, you have this issue of tribalism, very, very serious issue throughout Africa. It is in my opinion, it is a cancer. Tribalism, as Fanon said, is essentially stupid. And what it does is people are fighting, for this narrow-minded, backwards tendency that, when it becomes militarized and politicized, it can lead to great war and struggle throughout Africa, and it's very divisive. And so TPLF, attacked Ethiopia and Eritrea in November 2020. And what ended up happening was that the Eritrean people, the Ethiopian people, now at peace, now wanting to, come together, work together economically, socially, politically. Now they were plunged into war, and they were immediately defeated within less than about 3 weeks' time. And what happened was, when the Biden administration came to office in January, they basically provided all kinds of support for TPLF, and very openly, very brazenly, and then started instituting sanctions against Eritrea and Ethiopia. They actually instituted an executive order. The interesting thing that I want everybody to pay attention to, this executive order that was passed, I believe it was in September, around that time last year, was it actually draws on not the Magnitsky Act, but instead draws on local immigration laws of the United States. Why? As I said, the history of the Eritrean struggle is the people abroad are very much connected to the people at home. And what this leads to is this, connected struggle where you just can't bully the nation back there without getting some type of resistance here in the States. And so the Ethiopians and the Eritreans, and I have images prior to what happened in November, Eritreans and Ethiopians started to work together. And as I mentioned, the Eritreans had this infrastructure of struggle and resistance in the diaspora. Ethiopians were developing these things as well too, but it's kind of these newer structures, and it was disparate groups that were doing this, but they started to coalesce with the Eritreans who had that infrastructure of struggle already in place. So what then happened is seeing this and seeing the resistance that it was causing, this executive order was not targeting the diaspora, the people abroad, the people here in the States who are defending their motherlands. And the way I've described this is sort of what I like to call the Golden Trinity, where you have the diaspora, one, the government back home, and then the local population at home as well too, all working together. This is a unique situation. It's not common, but I think it is something that could work for Africa. If we can get these governments that can, that are fighting the good fight, resisting imperialism. So it was a unique situation last year where Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia were in the same boat, had a tripartite alliance. And we can talk about this more some other time, but basically 3 governments that were coming together, meaning also the diasporas were coming together. And so this, they started to see this and started to get concerned in Washington. And how effective was it? Let's just say it was so effective that it literally removed a Virginia governor for just as an expression of anger. The day we started the campaign, we started this campaign called No More, to say no more to imperialism, essentially. It's an anti-exploitation movement, but it was out of a year of frustration, a year of war by TPLF, backed by the US. And so seeing this backing by the US and the unbelievable levels of disinformation, deception, division, militaristic push, in the Horn of Africa, just outright, just like in your face, to the point where there was a US general, or colonel, I believe it was, who was in Djibouti saying, we're going to take actions in Ethiopia. And they use the pretext of to save their embassy members, basically threatening invasion of Ethiopia. And seeing that, the unbelievable levels of disinformation by CNN, people on the streets of Addis Ababa, remember, domestic population, the streets of Addis Ababa are holding signs saying no more. That led to people in the diaspora saying signs of no more, government officials saying no more. So that golden triangle that I was talking about, everyone was moving on the same accord. And this is a very potent, very, very potent force. And if I could really say what was very special about the Eritrean Revolution, this was a major factor. Eritrea, we don't know the exact numbers of the size of the Eritrean diaspora population, but somewhere in the ballpark of 1.5 million is estimated to a domestic population of about 4 to 5 million. This is actually, it was 1.5 to 3 million at the time of right after independence. So that is a significant level of the diaspora or the population, which are Eritrean citizens that are living outside relative to at home. So what that means is that you have this very special role that the diaspora plays. So it's not the same exactly in other parts of Africa, but specifically for Eritrea, which makes it a good anchor in terms of diaspora activism and other African groups rallying around the Eritrean community, working with the Eritrean community. So this is very much the case with this movement now. This had what had become a movement called the No More movement, where everyone was saying no more to what the US was doing. It didn't really articulate itself perfectly, but it started off just saying, no more dangerous US interventions and, undermining the Ethiopian democracy and this kind of thing. And, for the Ethiopians, Eritreans had their own message. Somalis, a month later, also began to say no more. So now you had 3 countries that were saying no more against this stuff. And then it became very clear that it was against sanctions, because what did they start to do? They saw what the Eritreans, Ethiopians, and Somalis were doing. So they started to push 2 sanctions bills against both. They removed Ethiopia from the African Growth and Development Opportunities Act. And then they continued to just push aggressively these bills. And in the language of these bills, if you'll believe it or not, it says disinformation. And again, it's drawing on, domestic laws to go after these diaspora communities. It says the people in the diaspora, it explicitly says people in the diaspora. So, and it's in another word, the word they use is agents of the Eritrean and Ethiopian governments. So clearly, if you resist sanctions in the US connected to your motherland, where your family, your people you're from, they're looking at you, they're monitoring you, they're seeing what's going on, and now they have this disinformation board, as we just saw, which people have, ridiculed as like the Ministry of Truth, and it had to go away because it was so unpopular. But for sure it will return. So I think that nowadays, people that are challenging sanctions here in the States, around the world, particularly again in these like Western nations that are the ones pushing these sanctions, they're going to be targets. And it's no longer, terrorism. They're not going to say terrorism anymore. It's disinformation agents, is what they're saying. So the people have got to be ready to resist this and fight against this, and should really start thinking about the role of the diasporas. If you are a country that doesn't have an anti-imperialist diaspora that's connected strongly to maybe the governments back home, it's work together with perhaps these communities that do, because we know what they're doing in Latin America, bringing particular types of people here to challenge the governments back over there. They tried to do that to Eritrea, but it's funny, when they do that, they come here, they come here, and then they eventually, you see them holding, pictures of President Isaias Afwerki, or, so they haven't been as successful with Eritrea and Ethiopia, it seems now. But I think we have to, the people of Zimbabwe, the people of Mali, a lot of these countries that are being targeted right now have to work together. Cuba, Venezuela, all these countries that are under attack, we have to get together. And I think that this movement of No More, which I wish I could go into it more and show you pictures and stuff like that to explain just how prominent it was. It was a hashtag, and it just became this movement where you're getting like 4,000 to 5,000 tweets per hour, and it became sort of this roving, what I like to call a roving digital army of peace. Whenever a country is under attack, they say, oh, we're going to do this. I'll give you a perfect example. Somalia. They were threatening actions against President Farmajo of Somalia at a time when, there was, you wanted to change the prime minister, which was legally, part of their constitution. And when the US saw this and didn't like this, there was a threat made on Twitter by the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, saying that we're going to, quote unquote, take actions. Right away, the entire No More movement mobilized on Twitter, and principally at first, and said, we will not stand for this, to the point where Somalia was trending worldwide, No More was trending worldwide. Somalis, Eritreans, Ethiopians, a whole bunch of Somalis changed their background to this hashtag, it says No More now. So, and that right there was such a clear display of just how powerful this movement can be, because what we saw was that the very next day, Blinken had to walk back that statement. And I actually had a picture for you, but basically where they didn't apologize, but they said that, we're working with President Farmajo now, or something like that. So it was a demonstration, it was a proof of concept that we could take this massive, that was Eritreans, Ethiopians, rally for Somalia, and the same thing was then done for Mali, and then all these different countries in Africa were saying No More, seeing that it was effective. And when you can mobilize, I'm not joking, millions of people around the world, which is what No More did, because we had demonstrations on November 21st, where all around the world in 35 cities, particularly in Western capitals was the focus. We had these demonstrations where, including locally in Addis Ababa, millions of people came out to the streets, millions, and said no more. And so it was, again, this is a proof of concept that you can mobilize, that you can take this huge digital roving army of peace to defend countries. If Cuba's under attack, if Haiti's under attack, or Venezuela, or whatever country is under attack on the African continent, off the African continent, we can mobilize and defend and support one another, because we all have things like hands off Cuba, hands off Zimbabwe, hands off Mali or whatever. But the thing is that we're doing this, independently, and we have to continue doing that, but we have to coalesce. And in the digital world, which is now where all the, where most people get their news now, and particularly on Twitter. And so to put that under a common hashtag like No More, it's actually kind of using their own strategy. Because if you think about it, when I say their own strategy, I'm talking about the strategy of the State Department. The strategy that they've used for a long time is through the National Endowment for Democracy, the Albert Einstein Institution, all these different institutes or entities that basically, quote unquote, wage nonviolent conflict and bring about these color revolutions around the world for like regime change. Well, we're just taking their model and basically applying it for an anti-imperialist perspective. So when they, when they do a color revolution, what do they say? Enough. Canvas teaches these people, National Endowment for Democracy, all these different groups, they teach them to, and Albert Einstein Institution, they teach them to use the word enough, and then to use the red salute, which they co-opted, and they always do the hat, the symbol of, like with the fist, and then they bring about a color revolution. They pick a color. Well, we have a color. We have purple. It doesn't represent one country, because purple is a very
Simon. I'm sorry. I need to interject really quick here, because we're moving forward. This is the beautiful thing about having a robust grassroots an international panel here, is that there's so much here. There's so much to be talked about. But I just wanted to shift just the conversation just a little bit, because again, we're moving into 1 o'clock. There are some questions that there's some questions that I'm going to try to make sure I kind of synthesize. But I also want to, Simon, one of the things that you actually show, which is very important here, is, this coordinated effort at the grassroots level and international level to actually address in a substantive way sanctions and, the things that are happening. And you're providing, which was one of the segments of conversations I wanted everybody to talk about, is how can we, really develop a united front? How can we understand the particularities of the conditions in our particular nations, in our communities, and also develop a united front, non-alignment? And there's a non-alignment movement. There was the Bandung Conference. There was a number of instances within which folk were attempting, coming out of decolonization, coming out of anti-apartheid, coming out of, Jim Crow, who was attempting to address these particular issues. So as we're thinking about that, I want to just go to the, if you have any questions for any of our panelists, if you have any questions, if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please, by all means, put them in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen. But I wanted to just try to at least pull one question. It looks like there's a question for Zimbabwe. And the question, I'm going to synthesize it here, is how would sanctions look different if sanctions only impacted those targeted? That's a very interesting question, because that's a loaded question. I mean, sanctions are going to go target more than just the folk who are impacted. And as for Zimbabwe, and I guess, Rutindo, if you can give like a little, maybe like 1 or 2 minute, if you can. It's, like I said, it's a very complex question. And then there's a question that we'll go to. So Rutindo, please, by all means.
Thank you so much. sanctions, if they were targeted, would still not be still not have a difference, because if the targets are being punished without a trial, that would still mean that the sanctions are illegal. And generally, when they target sanctions, they target the most important people in a society, your biggest investors, the richest people in the society, politicians. So what this does is that your investors that are supposed to invest in industry, supposed to invest in production, creating jobs, and paying the taxes to government, would be targeted by those sanctions. And so they affect your government's tax revenue collection. They affect the ability of government to give civilians enjoyment of their basic human rights and the creation of facilities for those people. And it affects job creation, affects the economy. So it wouldn't make much of a difference. And before I finish, I need to reiterate that any punishment that does not have any hearings, that does not have anybody being found guilty, that does not give people opportunity to defend themselves from the charges that are being caused for them to be punished by sanctions, are illegal. They're a violation of the Universal Bill of Rights, and they're a contravention of human rights. So they are illegal and should not be allowed, should not be accepted. And we actually had the US sending somebody who pretended to be a lobbyist. This is actually a member of the CIA who wanted to find out from us if we are comfortable with the removal of sanctions on the civilians and the maintenance of sanctions on the targets. And so we said to them that we are not comfortable with any sanctions that are collective punishment or individual punishment of important people of our society without trial and without a due process. Thank you.
Thank you. And as folks see in the middle of my screen, I have Obi Agunya Jr. who's here, who I must make sure, he's the one who brought everybody together. It's just basically like in basketball, there's a lob he threw up for us, and bringing everyone together. And I just want to make sure before I actually bring him into the conversation, I wanted to. There's another question here that the first part of this question really gets into the crux of what I think is important in these discussions is what can be done. What are some substantive things? And again, Simon provided those aspects. We have historical. From Cuba, from Venezuela, we have historical continuities or traditions of addressing these things. But what are some things that, maybe one or two things each of the panelists and, think that can be done? Because the question that was posed is the world set up in such a way that sanctions cannot be overcome through cooperation by non-Western countries? Again, these questions are very loaded, they're very complex and very, but also the way that the sanctions are developed, the ideas and the targets are very important. So what are some, Simon gave us, some examples of the No More movement, but what are some, in your opinion, particularly from Cuba and also from Venezuela, what are some things that people can do, some substantive things that people can do to address the violent implications of, and we'll go with Fabria if she's there, if she's available for Venezuela, and then we'll go to Cuba. Of course, Cuba has a long history, but what are some substantive things for those who are not aware of the things that we're actually talking about today?
Hi, yes, I'm here. And I'm sorry, I'm just about to enter our session here at the National Assembly. So I was receiving some calls. So could you repeat what you want me to talk about? What is the effect of sanctions on?
Yeah, so we wanted to give maybe one or two ideas, substantive ideas that folk can do to actually, because these conversations really become very big conversations. But what are some substantive things that folk can do?
Well, anyone, like denounce how are the impacts of the sanctions on people. Most of the panelists today have been very clear on how sanctions are implemented. We call it in my country unilateral coercive measures. Actually, we don't call them sanctions because they are a unilateral decision, as the ambassador said, and also the other panelists. And they affect the whole population in every country, and they affect their right to access equally any opportunity. So we need more, in the case of Venezuela, Lisa, and as it happens in the Cuban case, because they have been struggling for more years against the blockade. Our coercive measures are beginning to look like a blockade also for Venezuela. Is denounced. We need support. We need support. We have the numbers. There is a report, and actually for the UN special rapporteurs on Venezuela, I could send that maybe in the chat or maybe to an email if it could be published, because you would have tools by an independent, if you want to call it like that, an independent source of information that came to Venezuela and was able to see by herself and interview with the people, with every sector in government and outside government, even the opposition, and the people in general in Venezuela, to see how they affected economically, in health, and in social issues, in the social area. So we need that denouncing. I think never is enough. And every day we have different versions from each side. And of course, the most known version is the mass media. Is the one of the mass media controlled by the governments, the biggest governments, about what is going on and what really happening in every country. I would ask for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Ambassador Rivera.
Well, in the case of Cuba, there has been a solidarity movement for many years fighting against the blockade, not only here in the US, but around the world. For example, nowadays you have like what happened last Sunday, car caravans or rally around the world that has been carried out to demand the lifting of the US blockade. There is a national network of solidarity with Cuba in the US that one of the main objectives of their work is to fight against the blockade in the mass media, in their district, all over the country. There's a lot of misinformation about the situation in Cuba and the impact of the US blockade. So it is important that every person that knows it, knows what it really happened and how the blockade impact our lives. Talk about that with their friends, with their colleague at work, and even with the social media. So that is what I would like to say.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to give space for our friends, colleagues, and comrades for Eritrea. Ambassador Salam.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. What we have to do to fight the sanctions regime is that, first of all, we have to have a clear vision of what we want to do about these sanctions and the way they are happening throughout the world. And also we have to have structure within our own countries and also internationally, get organized and come up with the activities that can promote equal partnership thinking, but the main thing that each country, each group in any country has to have is that a free thinking. In some ways, a powerful country seems supporting another country, but there is no, as the saying goes, there is no free lunch. There's something that the big powers want from you if they think they're supporting. So until we get to a point that we have to live in partnership with equal footing, keeping our dignity as a priority as people, it will be very difficult to advance. So we need to develop solidarity in terms of ideas and in terms of actions, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So with that being said, I want to bring in Obi, if you don't mind, particularly in the context of this conversation as we are kind of rounding out. But I also want to make sure, for Zimbabwe, right? There is a lot of consternation, particularly, historically, around addressing, a number of issues. And so I wanted to look specifically at some of the substantive ways, because there's a lot of work that's been done. Obi's been a part of a lot of those particular efforts as well, but not only in the context of Zimbabwe, but with Cuba, Venezuela, and other things. So this is the reason why we decided to put this panel together, again, to pack a lot of information in, and you can pull on any strand that you want in order to understand. But I think Obi will be able to help us kind of weave all of these things together in a context. And also, I do believe our friends at the Eritrean embassy want to show us a video too, and maybe we can get to that as well. But Obi, I'll just bring you right into the conversation.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. On behalf of the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association, I'm honored to be here. I couldn't think of a better way to wrap up African Liberation Day. And congratulations to all the organized formations that organized African Liberation Day activities throughout the diaspora, throughout the continent. Notice we said African Liberation Day activities, not Africa Day activities, because speaking of neo-colonialism, you cannot talk about this and not talk about the direct assault on a day so special in the pantheon of our genuine resistance. We then must extend belated happy independence to the mighty people of Eritrea, who just had their 31st year as an independent and sovereign nation. So we're happy. We're here. This year is very special for us for a multitude of reasons. This year, the Pan-African giant that led the Guinean revolution, Acme Sekou Touré, would be 100 years old this year. Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the face of African resistance, transitioned to the ancestors in 1972, 50 years ago. And this year is the 30th anniversary of the Day of the African Child. So we're bringing a lot of things together. We would like to recognize Africa World Project for their wonderful streaming of this event. The political counselor, Dawit, asked me that while this was going on. So they're streamlining this right now. This is being streamed by Brother Elliot Booker and Time for an Awakening. We have some comrades from WRFG, an entity that broke away from Pacifica many years ago to be more self-determined. They will be having this podcast, this discussion on numerous shows that they have. We want to thank WRD for their efforts. And 2 local stations in Selma and Birmingham will be airing this in the upcoming few days. But we'll follow this up in writing with everybody that's here. To Ambassador Solomon and Ambassador Rivera, thank you for taking so much time out of your schedule to be here with us today. We say that what we're dealing with is the different levels and layers of solidarity. At bare minimum, those who use platforms to express their displeasure about sanctions, but moving now to the concretized action. The first thing that we must do is we must, in the challenge of wording, using one of the colonial languages brutally imposed on our ancestors, is to challenge their definition of the word. When they say that they are targeting, they're targeting certain individuals. That is very disingenuous because of the fact that when you have countries with a revolutionary pedigree, with a revolutionary background, that are truly one with their people, if the sanctions hurt the people, it automatically hurts them. It automatically compromises them because their main objective is to empower their people with no filter. So when they say that they're targeting individuals, but this results in resources, both human and material, that can make society better, then we know how bogus that is when they say they are targeting sanctions. But in the spirit of resistance, we say, we have some targets too. We must target the children of those nations. We must target the best attributes that those nations have to offer. We are with Eritrea at a moment where they are the only nation on the African continent that has free healthcare and free education for their citizens. For that reason, we must target all of the organizations that deal with affirmative action, all of the organizations that are trying to preserve historical Black colleges and universities, minority colleges and universities, predominantly Black institutions like Chicago State, our African independent schools. We must target them and say, build ties with Eritrea, build ties with Cuba, who has the highest literacy rate in the world, build ties with Zimbabwe, who has a 97% literacy rate in the world. So we must target them. Through the Mass Emphasis Children's History and Theater Company, our only adult play has been about the Eritrean women, gorillas, mothers, and wives. We're the first ones in the diaspora to do a children's play about Cuba's doctors, Cuba's greatest army. We seek to have a children's exchange with La Comunita, Cuba's national theater ensemble, and we've started that conversation with Eritrea. 12 years ago, Zimbabwe bestowed a responsibility on us to write for the Herald, making us the first US correspondent in their country's history. That is, so we target media. And the US Institute of Peace admits that Zimbabwe is winning the propaganda war against them. As a post-July 26th activity, we are rallying media all over the world, African in makeup, African in composition, African in concentration, and we're going to have a private meeting with Prensa Latina, Cuba's national press outlet, so we can have a people-to-people solidarity press outlet. There's a discussion going on in Eritrea to see if we are qualified to become the national correspondent, US correspondent for their paper. So these are the ways that we seek to deal with these things. When we come to talk about, we must remember the words of Barack Obama at his first inauguration. He said, the might of our military must be targeted, must be extended as through our diplomacy. He said, the might of our military must be matched by diplomacy. So when they cannot bomb countries, their preference, when they cannot assassinate leaders, their preference, they will target those nations and attempt to bring the people to the knees by the dismantling of the social infrastructure. And when you have the attributes that Cuba has, that Venezuela has, that Zimbabwe has, that Eritrea has, that is a declaration of war. Why would you target nations that excel in education at this moment in history? And for our people in this country, we are 12% of the population, but have the second highest dropout rate. 1.5 million children drop out of school in the United States every year. Our people are 10.3% of that demographic. So these are the things that people have to deal with. The dynamics of isolation. We cannot let any of these nations be isolated. So when we talk about building school relationships through education, building relationships through healthcare, Cuba became the champion of the fight against the corona pandemic. How can we not fight to empower their efforts in Africa? Where many people are talking about investment in Africa, I challenge anyone to find a better investment strategy than investing in Cuba's health work on the African continent, where they have 4,000 doctors strategically dispersed throughout Africa. And when they're not treating the sick, they're sitting down with the young people who have said, as an act of patriotism, they will not leave their countries and come to the United States, come to any part of the European Union. They will stay in their countries and deal with the hardship. So far, we are targeting the Cuban doctors in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, in Guinea, in Ghana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Liberia, and Guinea to begin this process. There's no reason why we can't look for creative ways to support that particular effort. We want to thank Cuba, Venezuela, and Eritrea in particular for their stance of the United States Agency for International Development. President Afwerki threw them out in 2005 through the Bolivarian Alliance of Our Americas. Cuba, Venezuela, Haiti, Suriname, and Venezuela said they have no place in the Americas. But when you do something like that, you have to provide an alternative. Lastly, we come to see how they manipulate language. We remember Cyclone Idai 3 years ago, where Zimbabwe was devastated severely, Malawi was devastated severely, Mozambique was devastated severely. And the United States said, help Mozambique in any way you can. Help Malawi in any way you can. Help the people of Zimbabwe, but not the government of Zimbabwe. The former Vice President of the United States, for the first time in history, openly went to the Organization of American States and asked for Venezuela to be removed from the process. The United States went to the United Nations to try to remove Zimbabwe from the Committee for Sustainable Development, to block it when it was their time to chair it. They tried to intimidate Zimbabwe into accepting least developed country status, where 37 of the 55 nations who have that are African nations. These are the things that we must know if we're going to begin to strategize. And once again, bare minimum, if people can just create platforms to express their displeasure, that's one thing. But today, why this is important, instead of speaking about Cuba, speaking about Zimbabwe, speaking about Venezuela, speaking about Eritrea, which has a role, we wanted to create a platform for them to be heard, for them to be able to contextualize their challenges. And at the same time, we're highlighting their resolve. We say that Rutendo and Simon are the best examples of patriots when real homeland security is on display, because they are 100% committed to securing their homeland. And I want to thank Simon for inviting me and extending the opportunity for me to be on the advisory board of the No More movement. I'm still trying to figure out how I'm qualified. But so these are the things that we are looking at. So once again, cultural ties, educational ties, independent of the State Department, independent of the United States Agency for International Development. We thank the World Conference of Mayors, who are going to be hosting the deputy chief of the Cuban embassy at their convention this upcoming weekend. We want to thank State Senator Malika Sanders Fortier of the 23rd District in Alabama for sending a resolution to the National Conference of Black State Legislators calling for normalized relations with Cuba. We want to thank the institutions who have expressed an interest in doing a project with the Southern African Development Community nations, Venezuela, Cuba, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, to create a digital timeline to show the parallels. Sometimes our diplomats can be misled, or not misled, but because they have a concentrated agenda when it comes to African diplomats, and they're thinking about investment, looking at small level business people in our community, mid-level business people, and a few who categorically are big business people. But what they must not forget is information is the first line of defense. And when the educational institutions develop projects, when health institutions develop projects, that will make it okay for the business institutions to feel comfortable, because it is the everyday people who have played a role in the Cuban Solidarity Movement, making it comfortable for Ted Turner to lend his voice when he sees fit, or General Electric to lend their voice when they see fit, or the US Rice to sit down with Ambassador Rivera when they see fit. So it is, and in a revolutionary process, we start from the bottom to the top. Oh, and I wanted to also recognize Attorney Sheree for her wonderful platform, Africa Esquire, who will also be running this program. So we just wanted to do the wrap up. We wanted to thank you all for being so generous with your time. And we want to thank Venezuela for pushing this Afro-descendant movement, calling for the unity of 200 million Africans in the Americas. So Africans in the US, Africans in Colombia, Africans in Brazil can stop saying they're Afro-Caribbean, can stop saying they're Afro-American, can stop saying they're Afro-Latino, but go back to what we called ourselves before, displaced Africans and African descendants, concentrating on the place we all have in common as we move towards oneness. So thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you very much for your substantive contributions. We hope that our efforts to complement your work, defending your nation, meets your satisfactions. We're seeking to continue to grow, continue to mature, continue to evolve as we seek to execute all the ideas we articulate following your historic and consistent example. We thank you.
Thank you, Obi. And I wanted to make sure that we just carve out just a few minutes for anyone or each of our panelists, if they had maybe maybe 1 to 2 minute closing. If they had anything else, you can share if you like, or if we're satisfied with our conversation today as a part of the tradition and the genealogy that Obi and everyone has laid out for us. So what I would love to do is give our ambassador colleagues and friends the opportunity. We'll start with Ambassador Rivera, if you had any closing comments or anything that you would like to share as we kind of move into the next phase, which is the end.
No, thank you. I just want to show my appreciation to Obi and to your organization for organizing this webinar, to our colleague here present today. In our case, it is always important to highlight the impact of the US blockade against Cuba. And it has been important and interesting to know what it's happening with those sanctions that are only applying not only to Cuba, but to the countries present here today that damage heavily the daily life of their people as well. So thank you for having me today and organizing this webinar.
Thank you, Professor. I'm sorry, Ambassador.
Yeah, there was one question on the chat that I would like to use this opportunity to say something about it. It was about the Eritrea and Ethiopia relations, if it's going to hold as the United States pushes one party against the other in that region. And what I would like to say is that the Ethiopia-Eritrea Peace and Friendship Agreement was an individual initiative of the two countries and two leaders. No one really did that except the two countries, and it's going very well. And we, as Eritreans, are going to work hard to make this relationship an excellent one. The thing is here, Eritrea has been pinpointed because Eritrea has been following a very independent path, socially, politically, economically, and some countries really take it as a threat that Eritrea becomes a bad example of good. That's why it's targeted. So the tripartite agreement between Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia was really a good initiative, but still it's encountered a lot of challenges, but it's going to get forward due to the support of the population of the Horn of Africa to that kind of independent thinking. We have a long way to go, but it's very, very hopeful. And finally, I would like to express my appreciation to the organizers of this event. This is such a great event, and we have to have so many more of such engagements so that we exchange our ideas and solidify our fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I wanted to give an opportunity to Ratindo and Simon. We go to Ratindo and then, Ratindo and then Simon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this wonderful platform, and to the ambassadors and dignitaries that are here. Thank you for joining us and giving us so much wonderful information. I was blown away by the strategy that has been employed by Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia, the unity that they've had together, and the solidarity that they've had together in the No movement that has been able to put pressure on these sanctions and even to avert invasions by the United States. And I would like to say we would like to join Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, and other African countries in building a solidarity of all African countries. But while we're using that strategy, I would also like to challenge us to say, join us as well in the legal fight against sanctions. We need to begin to create the international law and custom of fighting sanctions and Africans standing up and getting rulings and judgments We also have to approach the UN Human Rights Council, and ask them to make rulings and to approach the International Court of Justice and the African courts so that we can begin to create the custom and practice on resisting sanctions. And we must demand reparations. As I said, the resolution 3413 actually enjoins us to seek reparations for these kind of crimes. So that's what I would like to leave us with. And I'd like to say, can we create a database for us to start communicating together, maybe a social media page or a WhatsApp page, so that we can begin to get a hold of each other and strategize about the way forward. Legal, together with this digital army of resistance, is the way to go. And we all need to continue creating new strategies as we go forward and sending out information as to how these sanctions are working.
I just want to say thank you, Brother Rotendo, for your kind words. And I think, this is something that we all need to do. The whole point of this today is solidarity and, sharing best practices, learning and growing from one another, connecting with one another. So I'm very much looking forward to following up offline and after this. I also want to thank all the wonderful, speakers today, ambassadors, dignitaries. Thank you, Obi, for connecting all of us. This is clearly a very, it's an amazing platform and an event today. And I look forward to following up with you and all the others as we grow our bonds and grow the resistance. Thank you.
And thank you. And again, thank you all for sharing your time. We know we're in an age of Zoom, we're in an age of over Zoom, we're in an age of, but also we're in an age of also, using these particular mechanisms to engage in these substantive conversations that lead to actual actions that, again, as we're moving, offline and back into real grassroots organizing. Before I forget and before I leave, I wanted to, our colleague DeWitt with the Eritrean, you had a video, and I believe you should be able to share before we leave. You should be able to share. I think I allowed, I think.
Well, can I say a word or two before
Absolutely.
I need to put it in the context of what we're discussing. I mean, this is a wonderful, wonderful discussion going on. Thank you for everybody, the organizers and everyone who's been giving us a wonderful lecture. And one part of this discussion, if I'm correct, is what are the community-based initiatives been taken to defeat sanctions and to annul sanctions? And everybody gave a wonderful different ideas. And Mr. Brahane also talked about strategies. And our esteemed colleague from Venezuela also talked about community involvement. And we talked about from Zimbabwe and how the legal fights. And Simon also talked about the normal movements. And I think just one thing that I want to add is because sanctions are different from place to place, and they all are designed and with one goal. And that goal is to bring the population down and to replace the government with a puppet regime and do whatever whatever the agenda is. So within that context, the most important part would be the consciousness of the general population. If people understand they will not be nailed down by media attacks, by negative media attacks, by all kinds of psychological warfare. So what I want to show is we just passed on May 24, Eritrea celebrate its 31st year of independence. And that celebration is not just about independence. It's about defying all odds. It's about standing against sanctions, standing against all kinds of attacks. So you see people who are born in diaspora, people who left the country, but at the end of the day, come united, celebrating their country, their government, their army, and their policies, and showing unification. So that's what I want to show. It's going to be very short clip. So
Let me just do that. And yeah, it looks like just a dancing, but it's not. That's what I was trying to play. So, can you see it?
Yes, probably needed to share there's a little tick on the bottom where you need to share the sound. When you're sharing your screen, there's like a little, on the shared screen, there's like a little button you have to tick. So we don't hear anything, but we see it.
Oh, so you can't. Yeah, so these are like over 2,000 people just showed up on DC over the weekend, this Washington, DC. Like I said, celebrating the steadfastness of their country and that they've been defeating all kinds of media attacks and all kinds of psychological warfare. And these are like some of them are born in America, raised in America. However, it shows you how the population consciousness is important. So, okay, I'm done with that. So how do I do stop sharing? Okay.
Here we go. Wonderful, wonderful. So
well,
again,
I'm sorry for the sound, but I was listening, I was enjoying it. I was just doing a little bit of dance on my side as well. So, but what I was trying to show is the consciousness of the people is very, very important. Without that, we can't really move forward. And that's why I want to say thank you again for this wonderful discussion that we had.
no problem. And again, as Obi, really the most important point here, I shouldn't say most important, but one of the important points is providing a platform for people to speak, so we can really understand and engage in substantive idea exchange, a strategy exchange, but really to develop a collective. With that being said, we want to thank you. Yes, we are ending a little bit earlier because again, this is a lot. I think you could probably use this particular session for a number of things. With that being said, thank you everyone for their time, and again, until the next time, please be safe.